of course, on display. So I'm going to start from on this side, which is my left, going towards marjolijn on that end. And of course, I'm a historian, so I'll give context to the artifacts you see here. And if you have any more in-depth questions, of course, then you can ask Marjolijn, who is the archaeologist. So here, of course, we have shackles. These were not used for the hands, but these would have been shackled at your feet. We have one of the sites that were found here in the field. In the middle here, we have this little piece of plate, which is one of many. This is one of the 20 items that we have on Eustatius. Huh?
Yeah, people are still coming.
Oh, okay. Oh, they're coming all at once. Okay.
Something legal.
Is that everyone inside?
They're still coming.
Lie. I saw something. The grass for the cow, one of those sick ones.
Is that everyone? Is everyone inside?
Everyone inside. This thing inside. What is from?
I'll give all that to you.
They won't be inside. Hoe lang staan ze al daar?
Yeah, that's it?
Yeah.
All right, good evening everyone, welcome. I'll just give a general welcome and I'll go through the artifacts, of course. From a historical perspective, I will give context to what is exactly here and the artifacts that we have as we go through the building. For those of you that do not know, this is the Heritage Center. This is where we preserve and conserve anything that is stationed. So not only pre-Columbian and colonial artifacts, but also furniture, clothing, etc. Everything that is part of our history is stored, preserved, and restored here in this building. So over here, before I start, I'm going to start actually with this bell. Why is this bell actually very important for us here? Because this bell hung in the fort from 1764 until 1976. On June 12th, everyone may have heard of the June 12th uprising in 1848. This was the bell that was rung that led to the death to about 25 stations in front of the library were actually shot dead and left there for an entire week as a warning to not have another uprising on the islands. And a lot of people don't know this history. This bell was actually removed by Koninklijke Paramiraweg during the bicentennial in 1976 for the 200th celebration of the first salute. It was sent to Curacao, returned to the island a few years later. It was actually lost. We brought it back here, cleaned it up, and have it here for safekeeping. So a lot of our ancestors, when they heard this bell, it was meant death at the time. It's part of the African heritage that we have here on the island. Earlier I explained about the shackles that you see here. These would have meant for the feet. This is one of the sites that were found in one of the fields at the plantations here on Eustatius, also still in pretty good condition for the time. One of the interesting artifacts that we have here on Eustatius is we have about 20 of these where the word Negro is printed onto plates. These plates would have been made in the 1700s. This, for example, is English pearlware. This was made in the United Kingdom. And of course, with all the shipment and the trade Statia was doing, would have been brought here. This particular plate would have said, "Bring more cane to the mill, Negro." We actually have a lot of these plates in our collection that has these degrading texts to the enslaved ancestors. The colonial masters would have been eating out of these plates, so this is not for decoration. So you could imagine having to serve a plate after your master finished eating with the most degrading text about your race. We also have here in the collection other plates that are printed in Dutch that were made in the Netherlands that said, "Negroes doesn't have a soul, negers hebben geen ziel." And that was also printed on plates here on St. Eustatius. And a lot of these artifacts is a contrast to the usual artifacts that you see. The reason we have this little plate here on display, if you look to the right, it's a stark contrast to the beautiful Chinese and Delftblauw porcelain that you normally see, but they were also printing these degraded texts, and we have quite a lot of those in the collection. Oftentimes people think the enslaved ancestors were stripped of all of their jewels and probably in the little straws on the ship, but one of the things we also found a lot here on Eustatius are these manillas. This one particular was also found at Fort Amsterdam. That is the location behind of Smoke Alley. The enslaved ancestors would have had these around their wrist. This one is pretty small. We have them even in much larger sizes as well. These were used in the Congo as currency as well for a period of time, which indicates by oral tradition, a lot of us know that people are descended from the Congo here on St. Eustatius, and a lot of the artifacts that were found on St. Eustatius actually coincide with that history as well, bringing oral history even to fact. This is one of the iron rods that would have used for branding in the shape of an S. We also have some of them here in storage that has the West Indian Trading Company on top of it, but some of them even have just random letters of plantation owners and ownerships of different countries. They would have been branded before they were discarded off to other places after they were sold. As we move on now on this side, we actually have personal items that were buried with the ancestors. And the stark parallels to what you just saw with St. Helena and St. Eustatius is quite haunting, because just like how St. Helena had about 3/4 being young children, 3/4 of our excavations from the Gold Rock site are also kids between the ages of probably 4 up to 8 or 9 years old. And all of the excavations that we have here of the Golden Rock site are all most likely male. One of the interesting things that I spoke to Marjolijn about as an archaeologist are some of the finds that we have here. These white plates, for example, were on the chest of some of the enslaved ancestors. So from the Golden Rock site that was excavated, that many of you know as the GR 2021, the enslaved ancestors actually had these boards on their chests. There were no food on top of it, but we do not know as yet what that custom entails. And we are still trying to uncover what that custom would have been, because we haven't found this custom in any other burial site in the Caribbean, not even in Barbados or Jamaica or Haiti to date. So we're still trying to uncover what that possibly would have meant, because it's still a kind of new find in African Caribbean heritage in this part of the world. Another interesting artifact that was placed on a coffin is this artifact right here. We haven't deciphered as yet what it might be on Marjolijn, but
I think it's plant leaves.
it looks like a plant leaf. And another coin that was also there is this one that we know it's an almanac.
Yeah, it's from the Amsterdamse heren.
Yes.
It's an almanac. It's not a coin for money, but more a memorial
Commemorative.
coin. And on the back side, if you look at it, it has the date 1667, and there's like a picture of a book. I understand that you can't see it from the distance, but it's like a commemoration of an almanac.
And the date will also coincide with the burials that we see. Just for extra information, many of the enslaved ancestors who were excavated from the GR21 site were actually first generation enslaved Africans. So there's a huge possibility that everyone in this room has one descendant on that plantation. And over here is another very fragile, interesting find. These are actually closed fragments that were buried with the ancestors. You can see some of the clothes still have the buttons attached, especially this one, and some of the buttons that they would have had on their clothing. In our climate, these things should have disintegrated very easily, but miraculously, clothing have survived. We were discussing earlier, we don't know many enslaved burials that still had clothing found. You saw that they were in much clothing pieces or organic materials such as clothing in the St. Helena burial. But we also have, to show you how close the parallels are with St. Helena, there's also people buried here, who were buried here, that are stored here in this building, that also had locks of hair stuffed into perfume bottles that probably belonged to a loved one that they were buried with. So a lot of the things that happened on the island are, yes, very interestingly, almost the same that what happened here on St. Eustatius, even though they are not connected in that way geographically.
Yes, so what's interesting to maybe show is that this is one of the excavated graves at GR21 near the airport, Golden Rock. What it shows is the outline of a coffin. So you don't have the actual coffin existing anymore because the wood deteriorates very quickly. So you more got like little pieces and scraps of wood. Those are also kept because you can do analysis on it from what type of wood it is and those kind of things. But what it shows is that they were not just dumped in holes in the ground. They were really giving a proper burial. And on this one, you may not see, but you can later look closer at it. There's a little object on it. It's a conch shell that has been so altered that you can use it as a tool. So also tools were given, and they were placed on the coffin just like the coin. So there was a habit of placing personal items on the coffins. That's very interesting. Most of the people got a coffin. We don't have the full report, so we just have to sort of do it with the scraps of information we have. But one of the enslaved people was buried without a coffin and on its side. While in the coffin you're lying on your back like you're sleeping. And they were placed in a position like this on their side. We call that a fetal position. And that's really like an African way of burying people. And he didn't have a coffin and his teeth were filed. That's also an African custom that was not allowed for the enslaved people to do. So we're pretty sure that he came straight from Africa and was buried in his ancestral manner of burying. And what we also find is a lot of these things, and it may look like blobs, but that's iron nails used to make the coffins. And it shows that it was not just planks, but it was really met careful placed together. And it might be, because the nails are very well preserved, that might be an indication also why the textile is well preserved. Because if there's a lot of iron in the ground, you sometimes have more chance of textile being recognized or kept. But these are really special finds anyway for any context that you find those still in the past. And what we think is this is like, these are the coffin nails, aren't they? Yeah. And also the decoration on the coffin, I think that's very important because we know from other African American enslaved burial grounds in America that sometimes with little nails they make patterns on the coffin that relate to their cultural background in Africa. And in the movie you saw all these signs in the museum of in New York, and they had the Christian and the major, the Islamic symbols and the Jewish, but there were also more elaborate symbols, and they were more related to African religious symbols. So just that they had this one makes me wonder if we can find more patterns on the coffins. Well, another find here, it looks just like a round-shaped thing, but it's a coin. But this is an actual coin, so money worth. It's of George II. It's from 1737. I always have to think about English numbers. But what it shows is that the enslaved people did have some access to money, at least, but also that they valued their fellow enslaved people enough not to keep the money for themselves, but to give them something for the afterlife. And of course we haven't displayed them here, but there's also blue beads and a brown bead. It's always, the blue beads are called trade beads, and the blue, or the brown beads. And the blue beads we always have something special, but in effect they were also trade beads. And they were not made on Statia, also they were just made in the Netherlands and Africa. And they were used as a sort of barter money. So besides the money economy with coins, there was also a whole economy where the enslaved people could barter with each other with the blue beads. So there are a different system, and it was also to make sure that they wouldn't earn too much money or get too much money, because the Dutch wouldn't accept, of course, the beads as money, but they did allow the enslaved people to use them in that sense. And one of the graves of an indeterminate skeleton, so we don't know if it's female or male. That happens because the skeletons, to see if it's a male or a female, you have to have certain features still visible, and of course some of the ancestors have deteriorated so much that you can't do that anymore. But we have found the end of a clay pipe, an old-fashioned clay pipe, with the letters TM. And what is interesting about it, a pipe should have a stem like this long, because they had like long pipes, they were smoking like this. But this one is broken off, and they still find marks of use on this part. So probably the enslaved people were able to smoke using disregarded pipes. So these are all finds that they were given to the enslaved people when they were buried, that show a certain amount of care and an identity. It was not anonymous graves. They were given an identity. And what is interesting is what Raimie was telling about the glass bottle with a little bit of hair in it. Throughout the Caribbean and North America, we do find those kind of things, and it's often also associated with healing. And there were also 3 bodies excavated years ago at Witte Hoek, who are also here in the Heritage
White
House.
Wall, who are also stored here now.
And there was also a burial that we associate with a healer, and that person also had little pieces of glass and other objects.
Yep.
So there does seem to be a trend that there was also people who were healing. And of course, these are remarkable things, because we talked about the buttons, and it might have, often in the pictures you see the enslaved people with just a loincloth or barely any clothes. But these look like or shirt or pants, because pants didn't have zippers in those days. So if you had like the non-decorative small buttons, they are often from pants. And these, the more copper one that have eroded a bit, they are more like nice and visible. They would be on jackets or vests. So all these little things tell us a lot about how these people were buried as individuals. And the plates, that's indeed a mystery, but I have read somewhere in Gabon that they also place plates on the chest in burial in a certain period. So it could be that they were, of course, different plates in Africa, but that they just made do with what they had at their disposal here. So there are links to the way people in Africa were buried, or their significance. So I think we can learn a lot from studying those artifacts.
And also, and one of the things that me and Marjolijn also spoke about, by testing artifacts or the material that is buried here over testing the human remains, we can actually find out a lot about the whereabouts based on that information. Because everything is so well documented within the Dutch kingdom on the whereabouts of plantation owners, etc., we always have to remember there are about 300 people that we can link to the Golden Rock plantation based on name alone. So we shouldn't think about these ancestors as being anonymous. We do know who actually worked on this plantation. So there's even a possibility, hypothetically speaking, that some of the names in the register are actually now lying within this building, because everything is so properly documented. We know exactly who inherited the plantation from father to son. And one of the last things that we're currently trying to find out is when the Golden Rock burial ground was stopped being used as a plantation. burial ground. So we do not know as yet when the last person was buried, but we can have indications of when the first person, seeing there's a first ancestor burial ground there with the filed teeth that was buried on the sign, and the others are in coffins. So that goes on to show you that people were actually being buried there over multiple generations as well. So we still have to find out, and of course the big question for the community as well is, what do we do with the ancestors that are still actually on the site, seeing that it's been a plantation for about 300 years. So that means there are potentially a lot more graves than the 69 that were actually excavated in 2021.
And yeah, we can also guesstimate that from the data. We call it guesstimate because we don't really know until we excavate.
Yeah.
But I prefer we don't excavate. I mean, let them be a place for them where they can rest. But there are very few women. And if we look at the amount of children, there should have been way more women graves. So that's an indication that we haven't found the complete burial ground. And but at the time of the excavations, there were also indications that there were still other graves that were left undisturbed.
So for those of you that want to see where the human remains are, we will go through the building, which is at the back side there. We will go through that door. And for respect, of course, no filming or photos is allowed where the human remains are currently stored. So let's maybe come like in groups of 5 per